to fix something that is unstable. Given the historical perspective that Gita described to us, it's quite important to understand that in this system, the euro is almost a toddler. It's a very young currency. In the first few years of its existence, it had to prove a lot. Well, we now, against many people's odds, we can say that it survived that test. And we have been very busy in the last few years, especially in the last 2 years, completing the institutional setting of the euro. This means that the euro spent the last couple of years in an inward-looking position, but making it more robust, and we really can be seen, and we think we can truly be considered as a player in this system. The system is stable, as I mentioned before. We don't see a problem coming from that side. But the systems, and economic systems especially, are always moving at the margins, and the euro has a very important role to play at that. Not at the center at this stage, but at its margins. And if with a more robust euro, we can really play that role, and we are available to do that. This is not only a political statement, it's something that is a result of the many reforms we have been implementing. We now have the banking union in its last stages. We have a budget for the euro area, an instrument that can place like that. We have a very strong instrument in the ESM to stabilize the contagion of crises, of financial crises, if they happen again. So the euro today is a much different currency, and we can really play that game, and we are willing. It's not a competition. It's really something that we see as a way to make the system overall more robust, with a greater position for Europe.
I want to come back to Trump and sanctions later on, but I want to bring Minister Guedes into this conversation at this point, because the perspective of a large, rapidly growing, or at least for a time rapidly growing emerging market economy like Brazil is invaluable here. What are the sorts of issues that you see from your perspective with regard to your relationship with a dollar-based financial
Well, there are
system?
at least 3 dimensions that two were mentioned more strongly, and one of them lighter. One is a geopolitical thing, like she said. There has always been a dominant player, usually a strong economy with sound monetary policy that makes the purchasing power of money guaranteed, so people feel that they could buy and sell things in that currency because they are accepted as a means of payment. They preserve the value of the currency. They use it. They are stores of value. So usually there is this economic dimension that transmits power politically and creates political space. And it's quite natural that now Europe becoming a continent. You just remember some 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if you drive over Europe, you had to change currency 5 times. If you drive 8 hours through Europe, you would have to change currencies 8 times. As Europe consolidates, it's quite natural that a strong currency shows up here, a strong currency, which is the dollar influence bloc, and be sure of that. Very soon there will be renminbi as China grows up and becomes the strongest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world. There will be a currency, a dominance, a regional dominance of this currency there. And ourselves, we thought many times in Latin America of having, I would say that 20 years from now, if this is the way, aligning around political alliances or economic regions, if you consider the political dimension and the economic dimension, we would have 5, 6 currencies 20 years, 30 years from now, if there was no technology, digital technology moving in. So there will be one continental currency, the euro, another continental currency, quote unquote, the dollar dominance area, and China would have their currency. There are 200 million overseas Chinese. These people live in Philippines, they live in Malaysia, and they trade with China. They go back and forth all the time. And they trade in renminbis. And they will not keep liquidating their credits and debts using dollars. So the way the world is today with these two dimensions, we would be going to 5, 6 continental currencies, and that's it. But then there is the digital, the new technology thing, the blockchain. So the central banks will have to strive. Otherwise, very interesting, we had once the gold standard, which was a transnational, a supranational currency. But it was not functional. It was not easy to transfer. So the Libra episode is just an evocating a transnational digital currency in the future. It might be a private money. So the central banks are scared, and they are running to the blockchain. With blockchain and trust that these big blocks can provide, then you can keep with the government the role of providing the most used currency. So there are a lot of new pressures on this thing. One is the geopolitical, China and Europe refusing to have everything related to the dollar dominance. The second is the economic dimension itself, which is these regions will have to trade in their currency, something that they trade among themselves, instead of having to liquidate operations with other people's currency. And in that sense, the renminbi should show up as a strong currency, as strong as the euro. You would see these big 3 continental currencies, the renminbi, the euro, and the dollar. But then the digital shock moving in, and central banks running for their lives. If they go for the block trade, for the blockchain, and keep ahead of the private sector, which is very difficult, they could preserve the role of money as a public role. There have been many books on this by theorists. One liberal guy, like Hayek, dreamed of a supranational money, a transnational money. And these kids, with these new technologies, they are threatening all the time the old system. And so it's going to be interesting. But the key word is trust. And the pressures are political and technological. But the key word is trust. People use the currency that they trust more.
Thank you. Guido, can I ask you to give us your take on the likelihood of that scenario, of a world of multiple currencies, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then Zhuning, I'd really like to hear the view from China on that, precisely on that scenario, because I think that is out there. Many people find that plausible. From the point of view of global shares of GDP, that's where we're headed, multipolarity. Do currency systems function that way?
Okay, so given what we know right now, and unless there are major wars that take place, or serious walls get built everywhere, assuming that doesn't happen, I think it's a pretty low probability scenario that would happen. So let's just, why is it that people have, why is it that the dollar has such dominance? It does because it's the currency that provides incredible stability and safety. The best example of that is you had the Lehman crisis in the US, and in the 3 months after that, the dollar strengthened immensely, right? It is a currency that gained in value in a crisis that originated in the US. And so it makes complete sense to hold your money in dollars, because if things go bad, the currency gains value. I mean, in the case of the euro area, on the other hand, what happened in 2012 was, as soon as the debt crisis was in its peak, the only thing that peaked up at that time was the probability of the breakup of the Eurozone. That was at 72%. So if you want to be a credible challenger to a currency like the dollar, there can be no iota or even a tiny possibility that you would not be, that you would not be a zone the way it is now in the future, right? So that requires building up the kinds of institutions that Minister Centeno talked about. And so when you said the last 2 years you've been working on that, that's exactly what you have to do to get to making the euro a more prominent currency. But I guess I would just say that there is still a long way to go in terms of the banking union, in terms of the capital market union, in terms of a central fiscal capacity. The question on everybody's mind will be that next time there is a major shock, and it will come for sure, even though we are now in some tentative stabilization. The question next time, will the question come up again about which is the country that's going to lead the Euro bloc? Is there going to be a Euro? Who's going to be left in the Euro? As long as that's the case, you know, that's the one. And then, of course, there is China, the renminbi, which clearly, I mean, in terms of the fundamentals, China has the biggest share in world trade. It's a massive player. And that is a necessary condition for it, but it's far from sufficient, because what you need for that to become a major reserve currency, a currency that's used in international finance, is you need very strong institutions, very strong policy frameworks, highly liberalized capital markets, full convertibility. And all of that is something that still needs to be built on. And in terms of whether technology can fill the gap, I mean, what technology can do is certainly ease the way of transactions. So I can see people very easily switching from paying in cash to paying using a digital payment platform. But whether they will as easily switch from the dollar to the renminbi, now that is a completely different question. And that, I think, relies on much more traditional factors.
So this is a perfect moment for you to come in and give us the perspective from China. There was a moment in which people were discussing the scenario that we heard from Minister Guedes, the rise of China, the inevitable replacement, the internationalization of the renminbi. Is that a story that still rings true to you at this moment?
Well, I think we're still in the middle of doing that, but then I think, as a matter of fact, the percentage of payments through RMB actually decreased in the past 4 years than increased during the core period. I think there are two things I want to pick up on the previous speakers. The first is, I think I agree with what Jita said about, well, the dominance of dollar is not just a matter of the dominance of the economy, it's the dominance of a combination of historical, cultural, and trust issues, and it's not something which will change overnight. And if you look at history, which you're the expert, I mean, it took the US dollar more than half a century to catch up or replace the sterling to become the sole or the dominant reserve currency in the world. So, and China's economy is not yet over the size of the US economy. So I think it's something that's probably going to happen, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I want to pick up the minister's comments about trust. I think if you think of a currency, if you think of a payment system, trust or security is probably something that you care the most about. And regarding that, I think before we talk about the dominance of the dollar, I think we should probably take a step backward to think about the dominance of any sovereign currency. I think this is probably what's at stake after the breakdown of the gold standard, after we're pinning all the hopes on the US dollars. Now we're asking ourselves questions such as, how exactly do we price oil? How exactly do we price Picasso? How do we price an apartment in Shanghai? I think that is probably a more fundamental question about what exactly does it mean to have money, paper money, mafia money issued by a sovereign government. So I think that's the more fundamental question. But coming from China, I think there are two observations. I don't think that's necessarily official or civilian, but there are two observations I want to share. One is, I think a lot of Chinese do feel that China is being victimized or being taken advantage of by not having as much of a say in the global monetary system. I mean, we can talk about the sanction over Iran and its implication on some of Chinese companies. We can talk about the decoupling or the failed decoupling in terms of the spillover of the global stability of volatility into Chinese domestic market. We can talk about the Chinese limitation in deciding its own monetary policy, which you would have to, I mean, think about its feedback or over effect. So I think in that regard, I think many Chinese feel that we are large enough economically, but we're not having our due share of a say or influence in the global financial system. So I think that's one observation. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just sharing my observation. The second observation is, I think Chinese sort of feel that what the currency issue is now being used as a way to, going back to the geopolitical issues, that it's not happening yet, but it could be a powerful weapon or being weaponized when there would be some crisis or some tension geopolitically. And so this deep sense of insecurity that is probably motivating China to work harder than it would otherwise do to regain or to implement with some potential way of, I wouldn't say revolutionize, but to change the existing system.
I mean, and don't we have to come back to that question with regard to Europe too? When I asked you about the European perspective, you gave this very measured response, which I think in terms of the economic fundamentals makes perfect sense, which is driven by the internal history of the Eurozone.
Yes.
Is this even a remotely credible alternative to the dollar in light of what Guido was referring to, the 2010-2012 episode doesn't make it look that way? But the resurgence of the debate, which is posed literally in terms of sovereignty in Europe, not just in the Eurozone, but in Europe generally, is surely driven by quite similar concerns in Europe as well. In fact, specifically, the aggressive approach of America to Iran sanctions has been a driver in Europe as well. Can the Europeans really distance themselves from those kind of geopolitical considerations?
No, they don't, and they shouldn't. Indeed, we have this wonderful construct in Europe, which is several sovereigns sharing a currency. This is hard enough. Having a currency without a sovereign, I think it's an even more disruptive experiment, and I don't see really, I totally agree with Gita, I don't see this. I do see this with a very low probability indeed. And the challenges that Europe faces, not only with the trade war tensions or political tensions in the Middle East, but also closer to Europe in the sense of Brexit, those challenges unite Europe even further. I agree that we still need to further integrate our financial sector, as also Gita mentioned, but this is all really about trust. And trust is something that it's not easy to build, but it can be destructed very, very fast. And it is, this system functions with this, I will call that basins of attraction. And indeed, the basin of attraction of Europe is increasing, and it will increase even further if we make the euro more robust. A safe asset, Capital Markets Union, Banking Union, those are all instruments that we need to develop if we really want to play this bigger role, not in a disruptive way in this system.
Yes,
I want to make quite clear my statement. My statement was not that the dollar dominant, the dollar would be replaced by another currency. This was not what I said. What I said is, it is quite clear who would have a dream of a continental currency 30 years ago. I traveled to Europe 30 years ago. Nobody dreamed of this thing. It just doesn't make sense if you move 100 kilometers and you, instead of buying something cheap, it was 3 million milliliters, and then you change to 20 pesetas, and then 40 francs, Swiss franc, French francs. It doesn't make sense economically. So it was unavoidable. It was unavoidable. So in search of sovereignty, in search of economic weight, the French called the German to attack the dollar. First, they attacked the dollar in the gold standard. De Gaulle was not happy with the dominance of the dollar. So they cooked up a currency. And then themselves, they discovered themselves locked in a jail with the Germans. And when they complained, the Germans say, shut up and move. So this discipline, if you want to play around with your currency, you can't do it anymore. Now it imposed fiscal adjustment on everything. It was not comfortable. Europe was not comfortable at all. But it is a fact there is a huge, strong continental economy today. All the smoke out of exchange rate fluctuation disappeared. People are moving, migrating. Portuguese here, Turkish going to work in Germany. And this is mobility. So the market looks for efficiency. and removes whatever is not unnecessary, what is not workable, functionable, doesn't create wealth. So the same thing will happen in China. For how long 200 million Chinese negotiate with another Chinese that is in China will talk about dollars? They'll talk about renminbis. So there will be 4 or 5 or 6 strong, powerful currencies. An entirely different proposition is the dominance of the dollar going to disappear in 20 years? And then I agree with you. Not in 20 years. In 20 years, there will be 4 or 5 very strong currencies. The Eurosceptics, since the beginning, they doubted. And the reason they run for the dollar is that they didn't trust their very own governance. That's why they went there, because things were not better there. The banking system was broken in the US. It was not just Lehman Brothers. The leverage was 36 times. 36 times means 3% drop in the asset side, just vanishes equity. There's no equity. So the system was broken when everybody ran there.
But what they ran into is, after all, not American bank equity. What they ran into is the safe asset that the US Treasury could provide.
The trust of the institutions, of a market system.
And
powerful institutions.
Yes. Yeah. This surely is the neuralgic issue for the euro as well. It's not a question simply of the currency for trade.
It's trust.
It's also the financial markets that are associated with that. Can you offer deep, liquid financial markets which investors can move into and move out of?
And China is very far from that situation.
And the question for me would be, you use the word safe asset.
Yes.
It is an extraordinarily politically explosive issue for the Eurozone.
It is.
Can we move forward to anything like an equilibrium in the global financial economy without the Eurozone becoming a provider? Because right now we're in a truly historically bizarre situation in which America, with essentially incontinent fiscal politics, is nevertheless a safe haven provider of safe assets. I mean, and you know, if Chinese people have reason to feel exploited, in a sense, they help to finance America's fiscal imbalance. And the question is, as it were, is Europe willing to step into that role? But it requires an agreement on issuing debt.
It requires many and several dimensions of agreement. But if you go back 2 years ago and talk with people about Europe having a budgetary instrument, the reaction could have been the same. I'm not saying that in 2 years' time we will have something close to a safe asset, but the sentiment of integration in Europe did not fade at all during this last couple of years, and we had actually sort of a pickup in that sentiment facing these challenges that the European economy, which is a very strong economy in terms of fundamentals, in terms of unbalances. We don't have unbalances. We have a balanced budget. In the overall, we have huge savings vis-a-vis the rest of the world that need to be invested in Europe, and we need to play that part of the market as well. So the thing is, it is in our horizon to move ahead with this debate. The international role of the euro is something politically very important for us right now, and we have to put the ingredients needed for that. And trust. I totally agree, which is a similar word to stability and predictability, is the key thing on this game. And I think Europe, having survived against all odds, as I mentioned before, the euro itself, now can play that role.
And what do you judge the prospects to be of the development of a deep, liquid, internationalized financial market in China? Because that would presumably be a key element in any move, not just towards the trade internationalization of the renminbi, but towards it actually assuming the role as a major financial currency.
Well, I think building a multi-layered financial market or capital market is always sitting very high on the top of Chinese regulators and the government mind. And I think there are two things which have been developing quite well in the past few years. One is those Connect programs, the Shanghai Hong Kong Connect, the Shenzhen Hong Kong Connect program, which enable foreign investors to invest in Chinese currency into Chinese A-shares market, which is boosting not only the performance but the size of the market. The second is, I think, the inclusion of Chinese A-share into the MSCI, yes, which would force many of the ETF and the index funds to track Chinese market. So I think in that regard, we're going towards that direction. But there are two things which I think are going to take time. One is, I think, as Gita mentioned about the full convertibility and the capital flow account. I mean, now we're sort of using a semi-controlled way of investment, which is good to the capital market onshore, but then it's still laying in the back of people's mind about, well, do I really want to do the full convertibility into RMB, and will I be able to withdraw my money when I need it? So I think that is one thing that is probably taking more time than people have been hoping for. And of course, the trade negotiation is not making that any easier. And the second is, I think, more about China's own financial stability. Yes. I mean, a more integrated financial system is, of course, a much more efficient way. But what if there is a black swan event were to happen? Of course, have a more controlled economy is going to isolate the risk and to have things more under control. I think that is one thing, especially given the slowdown and given the popping up of risky moments in China's financial system. I think that is the sort of the trade-off China's regulators are making this day. So I think the step of progress is slowing down a little bit, but I think we're still heading into the right direction.
So I'm interested that you conclude like that, because 20 years ago at a meeting like this at WEF, we would have all resoundingly ended up there saying, yes, obviously the trend is towards deeper integration, that's where we're headed. And in due course, it will be a hands-off solution, and you'll just do conventional monetary policy, and that will take care of financial stability and price stability. But the trend, and Gita is as well placed as anyone in the world to comment on this, more generally, is it seems to me towards a Beijing-style pragmatism, which is that we look at the advantages and disadvantages of building multi-tiered capital markets. We are intently interested in macroprudentialism. A lot of the doctrinaire, if you like, or principled positions that characterized international economics in the 90s and early 2000s seem to me to be very much more moderated. We're quite relieved to hear that Beijing is not jumping into the cold bath of deregulated and full integration financial markets. Is that a fair perception?
Yeah, I think there are several people who are trying to walk out of that bath. There was very much the view that you can have very open capital markets, and it doesn't matter as long as you have a flexible exchange rate, you can insulate yourself from all the shocks that hit you, because for whatever reason, if people don't want to invest in your country, your currency will weaken. Because your currency weakens, you can export more, and that will help you, so you should be fine. That's not been experienced for many countries, emerging markets and developing economies in the last several decades. And I think it's just a recognition of the fact that if you don't, by definition of being an emerging market, if you don't have the deepest of financial markets domestically, the best financial stability framework, and if you've opened up, then you are going to get hit by shocks that are not all good. You absolutely get access to international capital markets. It helps you with your development strategy. It helps you with your investment. But there will be times when capital comes in and leaves at the wrong time, and your economy is very badly hit. And exchange rates do not give you the full insulation that you think it would.
They may even compound it, right?
Yes, and it can compound it. And this actually is a nice point, because it connects to the fact that when the world is trading heavily using the dollar, and when the world is financing itself internationally heavily using the dollar, it would be natural to expect that in the insulation you would get from a flexible exchange rate would be more muted. So given that, assuming this world doesn't change, the one in which the dollar remains is quite dominant, there is an argument for why other kinds of policy tools would play a role.
So I'd like at this point, we have 10 minutes to go. We have a vastly expert audience to bring questions in. I have my friend at the front here.
My name is Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore. I'm coming out with a book called Has China Won?, in which I argue that the US dollar, which has been a source of strength for the United States, could actually become a source of weakness. Because, as you know, with its use as a global reserve currency, America enjoys an exorbitant privilege. It can live beyond its means. But with the erosion of trust, which everyone is talking about, and at some point in time, when you get the inconceivable, which becomes conceivable at some point in time, and there's a tipping point, and the role of the US dollar slows down as share of world trade goes down, as share of world reserves, and so on and so forth. At what point does a tipping point come, and the US then loses its exorbitant privilege, and then has to live within its means? And what will be the impact on American economy when that happens?
Gitu, would you like to take this?
Yeah, this is, you know, there's a term for it. It's called the Neutrophil dilemma, which is basically the sense that we live in a world where there's so much of appetite for dollar-safe assets that somehow it is now incumbent on the US Treasury to supply those safe assets.
Which means borrowing.
Which means borrowing. Yeah. Which generates a whole internal inconsistency there, because if you're going to end up borrowing a lot, you're going to get to a point where the safety comes into question. I think that's the point you're making over here. I think, you know, the truth of the matter is that trust is both absolute and relative. So the question is, I think the way the world thinks about it right now is that while, you know, there might be some concerns about the size of the deficit in the US and the level of debt, but then relative to the rest of the world and relative to other countries in the world and relative to other currencies and what options you have, the dollar still remains very attractive. But this is an issue that comes up. The question is, do I think that this is going to have a dramatic effect any time in the near horizon? I don't necessarily see that, but of course it's going to depend a lot on the role the US plays in the world. But so far, there is a tremendous appetite that remains for US dollar-safe assets.
I mean, the last moment historically would have been the late 1970s. Between 77 and 79, this scenario was played through. Two things happened. The next best alternative, which was the Deutschmark, refused vigorously to take the assigned role of being a reserve currency because it would have been terrible for German exports, and built the European monetary system around itself to cushion the effect. And the other thing that happened is the Volcker shock. In other words, American policy preferences changed, turned on the dime, and delivered a massive monetary policy shock both to the US and the world economy, so as to restore world conditions. But Minister, you wanted to come in on this scenario?
Well, a moment could have been in 2008 or 9. It would be a moment of challenging the trust of the dollar because of the abuses. The last period that the US was really growing out of strength, forget about this recent period of trade tensions, and get back to 95, 96, 97, where you had a huge wave of investments in the US, and you had very high interest rates, strong dollar, but with growth. And then you had the bubble of the tech bubble. It blowed up in 2000. 2.5 million people lost money there, but they lost 90%, 100% of the capital. NASDAQ collapsed. It was a tech bubble. It collapsed. They put in easy money. They fixed that, but they had an unintended consequence. They fed a bull market on real estate and financials that run over up to 2007, 08. Then it collapsed again. As soon as they began normalizing interest rates, the market collapsed again. They put low interest rates again. Then they fed the great bubble bond. Interest rates collapsed, and feeding the money with. Certainly there was a huge abuse, economic abuse. Recently, it's a geopolitical abuse. So everybody's complaining about the geopolitical abuse of the dollar, using political power to punish here and there. or China feels threatened by it. But there was also economic abuse. Should Europe be mature and secure enough to stand by their currency? But they were questioning their very own currency. They were saying, no, we must have normalization of fiscal policy. No, the big mistake was when they put in one currency. It didn't mean that interest rates has to be the same in all places. It's like different states in the US. The interest rate that California pays on their debt is different from Minnesota, is different from Florida. Sometimes some states go broke. So interest rates could be a little higher in Greece, they had problems, a little lower in Spain, and zero in Germany because they had sound finance. So one currency didn't mean that interest rates had to be low to everybody. So they were not trusting their own currency. So your moment of challenging the dollar was not there because they were not ready. Like China is not ready today.
I just want to add one sentence. Historically, it's not just trade or economy that it determines the dominance of a currency. It's also war and military forces.
Yes, certainly.
Do we have another question?
It's power, it's geopolitical.
Yes.
Hello, and thanks for the very interesting conversation. I was wondering why countries which are under sanctions are not, by the US, are not part of the panel, or haven't raised any question yet, because the gentleman Zuning mentioned that very briefly, but actually some of those companies that have been put under sanctions have switched from dollars to euros, for example. Yeah. So some de-dollarization is happening, and it hasn't been mentioned in this conversation. Yeah. Can somebody elaborate? Thanks.
Somebody want to respond from the panel on this question?
I mean, I think the basic point is that there is some movements on that front. It's just tiny at this point. I mean, this is not in any significant, meaningful way. You know, the euro has been around for a long time, and the expectation was that the euro would have been far ahead of where it is now, but it's still playing a small role. China has been working on internationalizing the renminbi. It has swap arrangements with around 30 central banks in the world, but the inroad that it has made is actually fairly small. So I think this is more of a quantitative, the size of the effect phenomenon. And whether what we're seeing right now is enough to trigger further rounds of moving away from the dollar. I think that's where at least I'm skeptical.
Yes. I think there's also a key issue, isn't there, with the moving the conversation beyond the public sector, beyond states, because fundamentally the risks to private actors that are willing to engage in efforts to subvert American sanctions are so severe because the Justice Department plays hardball and you don't want to be on the wrong end of American legal action. If you're an entity which still has a stake in playing in the American markets and the American financial markets at all, actors who are cut out of those, for them the incentives quite radically change. Some of the big Russian actors, for instance, may be interested in developing alternative currency options in trade with China, but that's because they've written off access to Wall Street, and so Treasury threats don't affect them in the same way. Do we have one more question? Yes, thank you. To the mic here.
Well, I'm just curious about, looks like moving forward, there's a possibility we could have multiple currencies, or we could stay with dollar dominating. But my question is, which way will make the world more stable?
Well,
well, you may.
Who wants to? Yes, please.
I can give a very short answer and then allow the other members of the panel to answer. I think a multipolar system will make the world safer going forward than the system we have today. But I also see this in small steps. So I think I would value a little bit more the sort of movements that you mentioned in the sense, again, that those systems, they move at the margin. They are very hard to move from the center, and this is good for the system itself, and it's good for the overall situation. But I will see a multipolar system as safe.
The monetary system is a living organism. There's a long story, thousands of years story. till everybody accepted gold for its properties. And then we switched it to fiduciary currencies. And then each political unity trying to print its own currency. But if you abuse your power of printing, people get out of your currency and fly away. So it's a living organism. It's adapting. And it's clearly pointing to us that it doesn't make sense in Europe, for instance, to have like 30 currencies. It doesn't make sense. It isn't efficient. So the United States of Europe switched it to one currency. It gave more stability. Of course, there's a price. The price is you lose power to affect your local community. So a big problem we have today is exactly that 3.5 billion Eurasians jumped in the global markets. They muted the inflation. So inflation collapsed, not because the central banks, the Federal Reserve was doing a great job. There was no inflation because 3.7 billion people jumped in the global markets. Over Stoper, Samuelson, Theorem, arbitrage. Wages went up in China, and they were pressured in the Western side. And they brought their savings with them. China is investing all over the world. Africa became the continent of hope. It was the continent of despair. So they brought low interest rates, low inflation, and everybody clapped and said, oh, the era of the great moderation of the Federal Reserve. He was doing nothing about it. It was a lack of moderation.
So I see
they leveraged a lot. It was a big crisis. And people run to that system because they were ignorant of what was happening in America. If they knew, they would run in the other direction. So that is a fact, if you study what really happened.
So this is an argument, I think, for multipolarity as a balancing mechanism. Do we have other votes down the end here? So far, we have 2 votes for multipolarity as being more stable. Is that the consensus on the panel?
It's hard to disagree with multipolarity. The question is what we mean by multipolarity. Yeah. The active trade-offs came out very clearly, actually, between the two, which is that, on the one hand, there is some efficiency gains from having a common currency. If you're trading in international markets, most exporters are also importing goods. And the fact that both the currencies are aligned helps them deal without not have to worry about exchange rate risk. So there are some benefits to it. But on the flip side, of course, is you have what we now call the global financial cycle, which is that whenever the Fed eases monetary policy or risk rates go down, everybody else in the world has to deal with that. So the question is, I think there is absolutely a good argument for what Minister Centeno said, which is that it looks far more unbalanced than it should be. Yeah. And there could be some more balance. And I would just add one more point to it, which is, besides this aspect of the dollar and everything, I think another role that it's important to emphasize that the world needs more financial inclusion and much better cross-border payment mechanisms. And I think technology can play a very important role there.
Sue, the final word.
I think it may sound like I'm reading off Gita's script. I'm thinking of something that's like an electrical or digital version of the SDR, which you can have a basket of multiple currency, which is going back to the multipolar system, but we dynamically evaluate which currency get added or dropped, and then we dynamically shift the weight of the currency. And then because of the technological advancement, we could have that far more adapted than the current SDR than what we have.
Thank you. Well, the problem with these panels at Davos is they're always too short. There's always too much to say. But we've had an incredibly rich conversation. Thank you so much to all of you for this great conversation.